Welcome to Helsinki, what is nowadays the modern and forward-thinking capital of Finland. But Helsinki's history as a capital is really tied to Russia. It was part of the Russian Empire for over 100 years. In more recent times, the long border that Finland has with Russia has caused quite a lot of discussion, both in this country and overseas.
Leaders of the Nordic nations are gathering for a regional security summit in Finland. Top of the agenda is the growing threat to NATO members from Russia. Finland and Sweden both joined the alliance only after the invasion of Ukraine.
Today I'm exploring Helsinki, but I want to really get to grips with the Russian history that is in the city. So while I'm certainly no expert on the matter, this video is the accumulation of a few days of research into the Russian history in Helsinki and what the future looks like for Finnish-Russian relations. I have arrived at Suomenlinna. This is the ideal place to start this video because it really demonstrates the influence that both Sweden and Russia have had on Helsinki over the centuries. So, Suomenlinna is a natural island located around a 15-minute boat ride from Helsinki. It's part of the Helsinki archipelago, but it is most famous for being the location of what people thought was an impermeable sea fortress. And in fact, it kind of acts as a microcosm for Finnish history, really. You can see the Swedish Empire, you can see the Russian Empire, and you can see independence. So I think I'm able to go inside the fort here. Oh, it's a lot busier here than it was last time I was here. Last time I was here was December and it was very cold. I've walked up to pretty much the top of the fort. The sea is somewhere over there. We'll go and have a look at that in a minute. But I did just want to explain a first little bit about Suomenlinna's history here. By the way, I think it is Suomenlinna. So, the fort of Suomenlinna was built in 1748 by the Swedish. At the time, the Swedish had control of Helsinki and all of Finland. And what's important to know is that the capital was not Helsinki, it was Turku, which is a lot closer to Sweden. When the fort was first built, it was known as Sveaborg, which is still the name of the island and fort in Swedish. The fortress was built where it was to guard the coastline and guard the entrance to Helsinki. And the whole reason why it was built was to protect Finland and Helsinki from the Russians, because the Russians were at the time expanding their empire rather a lot, and Finland being a neighbouring country, there was worries that they would look westwards to Finland and ultimately maybe even further westwards to Sweden and the rest of the Swedish Empire and Western Europe. Now, this was built in direct response to the Great Northern War, which was a war between the Swedish Empire and the Russian Empire. This war was fought between 1700 and 1721, and Sweden had already lost quite a lot of territory to the Russian Empire as a result of this. Areas that it had lost included Estonia, northern Latvia and parts of modern-day Finland, and they did not want to lose the bulk of what is now Finland as well. So they built Suomenlinna, and it's sometimes been called the Gibraltar of the North because of its kind of supposed impenetrableness, but as we will learn shortly, that was not the case. So you can see all of some of the remains of the original fort here, and I'm going to try and get down there so I can look at the view of the bay that they were defending. So this is all the ancient fort. Some nice little ponds over there. I'm going to try and walk over there to this building. This park, Piper's Park, this actually dates back to Swedish times as well. It was first appeared in a fortress map from the 1780s. But I don't think it looked quite like this. This dates back to the end of the 19th century and it was inspired by an English garden, apparently. This is obviously a really nice time of year to see the gardens and everything. It's the end of May now. When I was here last time, it was so snowy. So obviously there was none of this then. So you've got the skyline of Helsinki here, modern Helsinki obviously. I was on that ferry earlier. And then this is what the Swedish Empire would have been wanting to look out on when they built this fortress. Mainly for Russian ships. Suomenlinna was built by the Swedish and was Swedish for about 50 years. But in 1808, the Russians took control of all of the area around Helsinki and ultimately all of Finland as well. Russian troops completely surrounded this area, and the commander, Karl Olof Kronstedt, just surrendered it. He didn't even want to have a battle. This was really surprising for the Swedish Empire, but this was the start of the end for them in Finland, and by 1809 Sweden had lost the whole country to Russia. So this meant that Finland became an autonomous part of the Russian Empire, and in 1812 the capital moved from Turku to right here, Helsinki. Now these grass-covered mounds, these were a part of the Russian expansion plan. And this was from the 1850s onwards. They started to build all of these. So from my very untrained analysis, I'm guessing that they were built with grass mounds on them to make it not seem like a fortress. So people who were planning to invade were kind of unawares. So lucky Russia, after they invaded, they had a nice fort pre-made for them by the Swedish only 50 years ago. So yeah, it was really kind of a desperate attempt for Sweden to guard this part of their empire that really failed quite spectacularly. So interestingly, as I mentioned earlier, the Swedish name for Suomenlinna was Sveaborg, and during the Russian control it was still called Sveaborg. So Sveaborg literally means fortress of Sweden, and the Russians kept that name to, I guess, represent who built the fortresses. After the Russians took control in Suomenlinna, they started to change the island somewhat. They built buildings like this one. These are the jetty barracks, and that was to house people who were stationed on the island. So thousands of Russian people ended up being stationed here, and the fortress was used to defend Helsinki and subsequently St. Petersburg, which is not too far away. And in doing this, it became one of Russia's key northern garrisons. Now, we're going to go into this a little bit more once I'm back in the city. But Finland gained independence from Russia in 1917. It was kind of in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. Finland saw its opportunity and declared independence. And one of the ways that you can clearly see how the city and the country has changed is through this church. So this is the Suomenlinna church, and this was constructed by Russians in the 1850s. Now, when it was constructed, it had the large golden onion domes that Orthodox churches are famous for. But after Finnish independence in 1917, they seized control of the island and they decided to change the church from Orthodox to Lutheran, which is the main religion of Finland. So nowadays, the onion domes are no more, and it's a visual representation of how much has changed on Suomenlinna and in Helsinki. Now, there is actually a wedding here today, so I can't go in. So let's head back down to the port. I have made it to Senate Square. So this square is the heart of Helsinki, and it has been ever since Helsinki was made the capital. And the first thing that you should know about Helsinki being the capital is that it was not founded by Russians, but the Russians moved the capital here. So in 1809, Finland was taken by Russia from Sweden, and Helsinki was made the new capital in 1812. So from the 1820s to the 1850s, this square was designed and kind of modelled after St. Petersburg. This is why these days buildings like this one do look decidedly Russian. There was a government Paris with imperial authority, and there was a Russian-led education system. But it is worth mentioning that Finland was the Grand Duchy of Finland, an autonomous part of the Russian Empire. So Finland was able to make its own laws, currency and army for most of the 19th century. And this is partly why there is still a statue of Tsar Alexander II here. Any Finns, feel free to correct me in the comments, but I have read that he was seen quite favourably in Finland for giving the autonomy, although I don't really know if he should have been seen favourably because he was here in the first place. But anyway, if you've got any more to add to that, then please let me know in the comments. While Russian influence was small at first, it grew and grew. Now, I'm going to return here in a moment, but first, let's head to Uspenski Cathedral. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Now, this is probably the most notable and famous symbol of Russian influence on Helsinki, perhaps Russian influence on the whole of Finland. So by the mid-1800s, Russia had ruled Finland for decades, and they were properly settling in. Russian troops, merchants and officials made up a growing part of Helsinki's population. So because there were so many Russians here, they needed a place to worship. So they built Uspenski Cathedral. And this was completed in 1868, and it was designed by Russian architect Alexei Gornostev. It served as the main Orthodox cathedral for Helsinki and the Greater Duchy. So Orthodox Christianity was the official state religion of the Russian Empire, even though most people were Lutheran. Now, it is the largest Orthodox church in the region, and it was built to be seen. The Russians knew what they were doing building it here. They wanted to show off that Helsinki was a Russian-controlled city, and they wanted it to be very much visible from the sea. And when I sailed in this morning, it was one of the first things that I noticed. It was made of red brick, which is quite rare in central Helsinki, and it's topped with 13 onion domes. And these domes were supposed to represent Jesus and their disciples. So this church was very much a statement, and it was built so the Russian Empire could basically watch over the city. It was regularly attended by Russian soldiers based at Suomenlinna and Katajanoka, and the Orthodox bells would have rung all the way across the city, despite the city being mainly Lutheran. The church operated under the Russian Holy Synod, which was the same system that controlled churches all across the empire. Now, while there were Russian diplomats, business people, soldiers all living in Helsinki, they only made up a very small minority of the population. Most of the people living here were still Finns from Finland who had lived here throughout. It is a real kind of power move that this massive cathedral, really imposing, was set up in a city that the Russians ruled but didn't actually populate that much. This was set up for very little worship, really. And it overlooks Helsinki Cathedral, which was built around the same time, and it was built by a decree from Alexander I, who declared that 15% of the salt import tax was to collected into a fund for two churches, so this one and this one. However, the majority were overwhelmingly Lutheran, and we're going to be using this cathedral. So, after Finnish independence, which we're going to talk about a bit later on, it was decided that this cathedral would remain Orthodox, but it came under the control of the Finnish Orthodox Church. So nowadays it is still used as a place of worship for the Orthodox population. That is only about 1% of people throughout Finland. So by the 1590s, there was a campaign of Russification. Russian was made the official language, conscription into the Russian army was mandatory, and free press was censored. So obviously the Finns were not too happy. So in the subsequent decades, there was increasing resentment between the Finns and the Russians. Now, the February Revolution in Russia in March 1917 removed the Tsar, which meant that his power collapsed in St. Petersburg. A few months later, in July, the Finnish government tried to claim more authority, but Russia refused. But with all the upheaval with the Russian Revolution, as the Bolsheviks were trying to consolidate power, Finland just declared independence. Russia probably wasn't too happy about it, but they had bigger things on their plate at that time. But despite that, this is definitely not the end of Finland and Russia's story. Now, I've detoured to get to this shelter behind me. Well, nowadays it's the entrance to an underground station, but it has relevance. This was designed by a man called Alvar Aalto, and he won the bid to design all of the entrances to the bomb shelters in World War II in Helsinki. It's actually called Amno Park now, but I'm pretty sure it is just the entrance to a metro station. Yeah, so this is a random little slice of World War II history in Helsinki. But yeah, it was supposed to be the entrance to a bunker. Now, as I walk down here, it's a good opportunity to talk about Helsinki post-independence and during World War II. For 22 years after Finnish independence, Finland and Russia kind of had neutral relations. But in 1939, during the Second World War, the USSR invaded Finland and they started what was called the Winter War. This is because Moscow wanted more land as a buffer to protect Leningrad, and again because of the age-old relationship they had with Finland. But the Finns famously fought on skis and managed to defend their country. So it ended in 1940. Finland did lose territory, but it did remain independent. Later on in the Second World War, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union and Finland joined the war again, but this time not officially as part of the Axis, but they cooperated with Germany. The main aim here was because the Soviets had already invaded them and they wanted to regain the land that they'd lost in the Winter War. So the war obviously ended in September 1944 and Finland signed an armistice agreement with the USSR. What they hoped would follow was an everlasting period of being neutral. So while these bunkers were designed for the Second World War, they were never actually used. And nowadays it looks extremely desolate. Now this brings me to Helsinki Station. A station that started to be built during the last years of the Russian Empire, was built in traditional Finnish style, and these days has a Ukrainian flag flying on the top. Quite a fitting spot for the last section of this video. Post-World War II, Finland and Russia maintained a certain neutrality. Unsurprisingly, there was tension, but Finland tried to maintain good relationships due to the fact that they've got such a long border. They very much are neighbours. This station was commissioned in 1904 and it was built between 1910 and 1919. Its style is national romantic, which is inspired by Finnish nature and mythology. So it's very different from the neoclassical Russian architecture around Senate Square. Now, the reason why it took quite a long time to build was that the construction was actually delayed due to World War II and Finnish independence. But after independence, it became a symbol of Helsinki moving on, but that didn't mean that it was peace. I'm not going to get into this too much now, but in 1918, Finland fell into civil war. Now, the Finnish Civil War lasted for 3.5 months, and it was caused by clashes between the Red Guards, who were the kind of the working class, and the White Guards, who were the middle class. And the White Guards ultimately won. Up until March 2022, you used to be able to take a train from here to St. Petersburg in Russia. But we all know what happened in March 2022.
This morning, Russia continues its invasion of neighboring Ukraine, attacking from the north, south, and the east, closing in on the capital.
And it caused a lot of hostility and anxiety and resentment between much of the West and Russia, but especially places that have been occupied by Russia previously. So following the events of March 2022, Finland abandoned its policy of neutrality. It applied to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to hopefully protect it from any Russian aggression in the future. So it joined NATO in April 2023 and became a NATO capital. It's one of the only NATO countries bordering Russia, and it has a whopping 800-kilometre border. Plus here, we are only 200 kilometres from St. Petersburg. But given its history just over 100 years ago, you can obviously completely understand why it's very important to Finland to be a part of NATO these days. It is a real shame that you can't board a train here and get off at St. Petersburg anymore. And I really hope in the future Russian policies change, Russia stops fighting in Ukraine, and relationships improve. But for now, they're kind of at a stalemate. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and I hope you found it interesting. There's definitely a lot more to unpack, but I did have limited time today. And there's definitely so much more to talk about when it comes to Helsinki history. So let me know in the comments if there's any other aspects that you'd like me to cover at some point. I do like coming to Helsinki because I find it a really good place to travel overland to. If you're sticking around, then I recommend checking out this video that I filmed in Berlin, which is all about the Berlin Wall. I'm just about to get on a ferry to Mariehamn in the Åland Islands. I'm going to be recording a video there and of course recording my ferry journey. So if you want to check those out and you're not already subscribed, make sure to press that button. And thank you so much for watching this video and I hope I'll see you next time. Bye!